Well, thank you very much for an excellent audience participation over the last 2 days. This is the final of 30 presentations with 27 speakers covering what I think is an incredible, diverse approach to diving and how we can apply human factors. And it's not just the diving side. It's also bringing in, the sort of traditional sports diving, technical diving. It's also bringing in ideas and concepts from the oil and gas industry. So with Diane Chadwick-Jones talking about a just culture and turning things around. And to me, just culture and psychological safety are the bedrock of applying and creating change that's out there. Because we don't have those two concepts in place, then it becomes very difficult to apply learning from error and everything that's going on. So I started off yesterday talking about a voyage and a voyage, and I there we go, human error, it slipped, I forgot with everything else that was going on. And the reason why I said a voyage and not a journey is because a journey has got a finite end. We go from A to B, whereas a voyage can be a lot longer. It might not have an end. We would like to know where it's going to be, and I've got some ideas of where human factors in diving could get to. My sort of ultimate aspiration is something like the aviation safety reporting system that exists in aviation, that's managed by NASA, that sits at a global level within diving. And the reason why I say at a global level is because then you can hide the individual events within the data. And we get round some of the problems about discovery, and we get around the issues of not just the legal discovery, but also the bit that's about the feeling safe within the environment, that people don't want to necessarily talk about them, the events that have happened, because of fear of criticism. And I know people who've used some of the forums, and they've shown incredible courage to talk about adverse events, and they know how it made sense, and they've gone out there and told their story, but they still feel really hurt when people come in and just throw metaphorical rocks at them for being stupid, idiotic, and just really put them down. And it's hard, and I've been there myself, and you sit there and go, yeah, I'm going to talk about this, and then somebody criticizes you, and it's really hard not to get wound up and jump in and start defending yourself and reiterate that process. So what I'm going to talk about now is, I'm just going to, in fact, just highlight some of the key points from the presentation that line up with the threads that have gone through. And I've had some, some great compliments in terms of the quality of speakers that are here, and the fantastic stories and the knowledge that's been imparted from their own experiences. And so it is this bit, and I purposely chose those individuals. I wrote to them and said, look, I'm putting this conference together. It's something that's had genesis for a couple of years, but it wasn't till February this year where I watched a veterinarian medicine human factors conference. And it's like, right, I'm going to do something. And then I missed the pre-season for the Northern Hemisphere anyway, because I realized that by the time we got to Easter, it was going to be too late. And what I wanted to do was something at the start of the season. So I thought, right, we'll do it near the end of the season. And hopefully people will then spend the down months, not that there is a diving season, depending on the sort of diving you do, but spend the next few months thinking about all of these. And in fact, we just had 2 presentations ago in one of the sort of closed sessions behind, saying, there is just so much in here. And if they put a world, a sort of a globe, and started pinning points on this globe to say there's this topic and this topic and this topic, and they all join together, and it is incredibly messy. And I think that's one of the challenges in trying to bring human factors into, I'm going to say, immature when it comes to the knowledge and application of human factors. It's such a difficult thing, because you say, well, where do you start? And people don't like big problems to solve. They want to eat that elephant one bite at a time. And to that end, I'm going to sort of go through some of the key areas. So start off with Diane Chadwick-Jones and Dave Conlin. Diane talking about the process by which British Petroleum took an existing just culture system that was based on the work by James Reason, and had this line that was drawn in the sand. And it's not about where that line is drawn, but about who draws it in many cases. And as an organization, they turned that around by getting rid of the confrontational, punishment-based language that was in there, and turning it around and getting stakeholders involved, including the legal teams, to get a more inclusive learning basis around this, to understand the systemic issues within an event, and say, right, instead of just fixing the individual, because there's no point in fixing the individual. If you don't fix the system, address the system, the next person you put in there is going to fall foul of the same things, because we are a product of the environment we're in. And then Day Conlin talking about being on the inside of a law enforcement investigation, which is not learning based. It's all about trying to find blame. And this is something that David Kincannon picked up is, is there a legal issue? Is somebody break the law? If not, not interested. And, the tenacity of the law enforcement organizations to find that should be applauded, but they shouldn't be applied in a learning environment. And the work that the US Forest Service have done with their learning reviews is to be congratulated. And I'm really, I'm going to say, surprised that hasn't been adopted, but I also know that people don't like change, and they don't necessarily like losing control. The next bit I'm going to bring out is from Professor Simon Mitchell and Dr. Mike Rothschild on the value of checklists. This is a pretty well-known thing. And one of the reasons, I brought both of these in, and it's like, why have you got two people talking about checklists? Well, one, it's really important, and understanding them from two different perspectives. So Mike's side, I chose Mike because it was about the tactical implementation of checklists, and his checklist project that's out there of creating something that is really quite simple, but to prompt action by the individual divers at the last minute, very much at an individual level. Whereas I then brought Simon in to talk more about the operational and the strategic side, because unless, as he highlighted, unless you have senior management buy-in, and at a hospital that can be at the trust level or the department level, but it is important to get the culture and the operational environment bought in. And in fact, it was one of the things that's been brought up in when they look at reruns, or science is about replication to prove that you can do it again and again. When they started to look at the checklist implementations and why they were successful in some areas and why they weren't in others, a lot of it wasn't to do with the checklist design. It was more about the social and cultural implementation. And the success that came about from the World Health Organization's Surgical Safe Checklist program was about the empowerment to give staff in the operating theatre to say, stop, we are not going any further. And this ties in with Sally's presentation with, the difference between sort of diving and aviation, and this real brain aha moment was anybody can thumb a dive at any time for any reason. Now, that isn't as universal as it should be. There are so many events that are out there that in hindsight, people would say, I wish I'd said something. But if you can create that culture that allows you to use well-designed, well-validated checklists, then actually you're going to have, an exponential growth in terms of reducing events. Now that poses a bit of a problem in terms of event and incident, and I'll come on to that in a minute. And that's something that Frauke from Dan Worldwide picked up as well. So the presentation from Matthias this morning on changing attitudes at a club level, and I've because all of these were recorded, I watched Matthias's presentation before this morning because I wanted to hear what he got to say, because I knew I wasn't going to be able to be in two places at once. And it's fantastic. People just like, it's got to be done at an agency level. And what Matthias and Stuart, cousins within the same club, have done is they've taken the concepts and the tools and the ideas and applied them to the club environment, starting by getting away from the shaming that's associated when things go wrong. their wooden weight belt award that they used to have, where it was the biggest screw up of the year, the most memorable one, and then you basically put people on stage. You go, hey, well done for screwing up. And it's like, well, hang on a minute, that's not, you know, the way to learn, because people will hide things, and that's not just, you know, at a club level. If you are going to punish people for certain activities, you won't find out what's going on. And that's been proven in the high-risk safety industries that are out there, that this concept of lost time and incident fatality rate, or, you know, this is 300 days since we've had an accident. Look at us, we're awesome. And you sit there and go, okay, somebody's had an accident that's reportable. Who's going to be the one that breaks that? Who's going to be the one that puts their hand up and say, you know what, I made a mistake and I've lost some time? And it's even more the case if you have financial bonuses tied to that. Now, in the diving industry, there are huge opportunities for learning. And, you know, even when it comes to the violations that are there, and anybody who's seen a presentation that I've done on human error and violations, with the exception of sabotage, intentional destruction of what's going on, everything is a learning opportunity. Now, that doesn't mean that, you know, just culture is no blame, definitely. But we have to look at these things and say, why is it that people are breaking the rules? And there's a whole bunch of research from Denham Phipps that looks at that in the anesthesia world. Why do anesthetists break the rules? So we have to look deeper than that's there. And that brings me to a point just now, before I disappear off in a tangent, is that, you know, anything that is referred to in people's papers and the proceedings, presentations, they'll be available in the recordings section, the software that's available. So there'll be a huge resource for people to take their learning further. Tim Clements talked about human factors in CE marking, or British Standard EN marking, as it is now that we've left the EU and we've got our own standard sets. Now, what Tim had brought out was this huge disparity between the technical assessment of the equipment, and the ratios was something like sort of 45 to 5, 45 to 10, that sort of ratio. So 1 in 9, 1 in 10 is the sort of numbers that of the difference between technical stuff and human factors, and not just what they were talking about as the human physiology, that factors of the human, but also the biases that come in when it comes to assessing equipment. You know, if you're a trainer and you're being brought in by the manufacturer, you have a vested interest in making sure that you tell them the good information. Now, that might be, you know, obvious to say, well, no, everybody's going to be honest. But there might be a point where you turn around and go, you know what, this is absolutely rubbish. And there's it can't be worked. And then there's going to be major commercial implications, because by the time you get to manual testing, the man testing that goes on, the tooling has happened. And so there's a big commitment on the part of the manufacturer to make sure that this works. And also the next bit that Tim was talking about was the cognitive assessments of how do those man test divers really take into account the novice divers. In the aviation world, which is where I come from or came from, test pilots are taught to think like novices. Now, that's a huge investment to get somebody up to being a test diver. But we could start that process by training those test divers to understand the cognitive biases and really deeply understand them. And I've certainly been involved in some of the discussions about trying to work with Red Bear to say, how do we build this in? And then the next step is, as a manufacturer, when they hand over the materials to the training agencies, if they've stipulated some of the human factor stuff that's been recommended in the HSE reports that are out there and in the published literature of how automation works, then actually it starts to trickle down. So it's another facet of this journey, another leg of this journey. And then I would say the biggest piece here that, and again, why I invited my instructors, human diver instructors, to talk about different aspects of diver training, rather than theoretical stuff like Bart talked about, normalization of deviance and understanding that, and Beatrice talking about communication, and Jenny talking about situation awareness and explaining those concepts to people. But Helen talking about, teaching human factors to novice divers, getting them in early so that they know what this vocabulary is about, what the language is about, what the tools can be. It doesn't have to be complex, but it is about understanding these things. And my background, say aviation, from the very first bit where you're going through ground school, learning to fly, you get introduced to the concepts of crew resource management and human factors and human error and the value of checklists, because we are fallible. And it's not just a one-touch thing. It goes through your professional, continual professional development, being a navigator, being a trainer on the squadron, understanding and assessing others and how they perform, which is where Mike talked about, dive mastering and building on the dive masters, giving them the skills that are needed to build on that human factors, or those human factors concepts and non-technical skills. Guy taking it to the next level in terms of technical training, and how do you weave this throughout your training programs. And Guy and Mike and Helen have done the training with me, so they know those, and they've basically lived and breathed it, because they're able to teach this stuff. That can go into instructor development programs, and that's what Daryl was talking about in terms of working with RAID, and I'm working with GUE to try and get some of these concepts in there. Because if we get the instructors trained, or start off with the instructor trainers to understand the concepts, they can then teach the instructors, who can then teach the divers who are out there. It's very difficult to create change bottom up, and that's what's happening at the moment. You can have wholesale change, or much bigger change, when the organizations buy into this, because then it's like, okay, that works. And I'll talk about that in a minute. Daryl also talked about, as a dive center owner manager, what he does to develop his staff, to give them the skills to make better decisions, to ultimately manage risk more effectively. And it's something that when I talk about risk management to divers and instructors, I try to change the language here and say, actually, instead of talking about risk management, because risk is such a nebulous concept, because of some of the stuff that Valerie touched on yesterday, of when we talk about risk matrices, when you're trying to work out the likelihood of something going wrong, that's how it is. It's cognitive biases. If we haven't got that feedback of understanding when things go wrong, then it's very difficult to build that into our own programs. So what we can do is we can change it to say uncertainty. Let's do uncertainty management. How can we make things more certain? Which again ties into Valerie's bit of Todd Conklin's questions. What's going to kill you? What's going to stop killing you? And how do you know? And is it enough? So it's this bit that says, I have control measures in place, the prevention side of that bow tie, the bow tie propeller that Valerie was talking about. We've got the stuff beforehand, the controls for the risks to try and reduce the likelihood of the event. And then we've got the mitigations afterwards. And then there's this bit that says, the controls, okay, fine. We manage those relatively constantly, and we to prevent the bad things going off. But what about the mitigations? When was the last time you validated your emergency action plan, or did a practice rescue? And this is something that chatted with, I think it was Andres, talking about going into a dive center and saying, how do we change attitudes to that event? So, navigating that journey ahead is not easy, especially when we've got this concept here of the adoption of technologies. And it really, we have to deal with this chasm that is existing there. And this is a well-known framework for IT especially, but technology adoption. And it can be applied, I believe it can be applied to this environment as well. So the left-hand side, we've got innovators. They don't particularly, they do technology or adoption because they are just out there. They want to trial the new things, and they will try and get hold of companies and organizations before the marketing plans are already out there. Now, they're not particularly, they are a bit cost savvy, so that they don't want to spend lots of it, but they like adopting new ideas. Visionaries are the next step. And I would say that pretty much everybody in this audience those who are watching it live or those who've got it recorded are going to be in that visionary early adopter phase. Now, those people, they are willing to spend, they're willing to get new ideas, but they're doing it because of, not from a technology point of view, but because they recognize it has value. And for that, thank you very much for making the time investment. That's 16 hours of this, plus all of the time that you're going to spend watching the recordings and making notes and things, plus the monetary investment. It's not a huge amount, but it is a lot for people. And that's one of the concepts, and I'll cover in the very last slide where I talk about the challenges of trying to cross this chasm. Now, getting people who are vocal, who are well known, the same as Simon and I were talking about the checklists, is actually getting well-known individuals, role models, to say this is a good thing. And then we end up in the rest of the curve. It's really important that you as visionaries are able to talk about this and the value. And I get that's hard. The questions are normally about how do we implement this? And that's one of the things that I sort of said to the speakers is I'd like to have some, your theory, your stories, but I also want to have the key takeaways. What is it that people can take from your presentation and apply straight away? So, these are probably, well, they're 5 topics, but they're 4 slides that cover areas that could be considered. So the first off is language. And I already said about learning reviews and learning investigations in my last presentation where I was talking about the messy world of diving. I wrote a blog for In-Depth blog, which is on the GUE website, just talking about the role of agency when discussing diving incidents and the power of language that's there. And that was based on this paper that I'll put in the recordings area from Krista Vessel. And it was fundamental in changing how the US Forest Service changed their investigations. They then moved them, simply investigation, serious accident investigation board through to learning review. And there's some fascinating stuff in that, just talking about the way that different cultures will look at things in a very different way. So one of the key sort of light bulbs for most people when I talk about this is the difference between collectivist organizations or collectivist cultures versus individualist. And they sort of demonstrated this in a little experiment where they showed a number of different people from those different cultures the same video. And the video was somebody holding a balloon and putting it into a box. Now that box, unbeknownst to them, had some drawing pins, some pins in there. So when the balloon was put in there, it popped. Now, those who were individualistic in nature said the man popped the balloon, putting it in the box. The collectivist view was the balloon was popped when it went into the box. Now that might appear to be, I'm going to say semantic, and technically that's correct. It's the different meanings that are there. And we have to shift away from individual blame and attribution, this dispositional attribution, looking at an individual and their behaviors, be good or bad. And then it's saying, actually, let's look wider, and the situational attribution to say, how does it make sense for that person to do what they did? And that's what the whole learning review process was about, is actually getting different stakeholders in to say, let's talk about what happens. And the key for this was understanding what normal work looks like, because you can then better understand how workers or even how divers are creating safety dynamically. And listening into Robin and Pierre's presentation just now, looking at the successes and the fact that they didn't really celebrate an amazing rescue from diver 2 pulling Pierre back into the bell in just under 3 minutes. Now that was the fastest rescue that ever been taken. And they didn't go back and look and say, what made that a success? Oh, it's because diver 2 was awesome. Okay, so how did diver 2 become awesome? What was the stuff that we can look at, we can replicate and understand what was going on? So language would be the first thing. Look at things from a different perspective, and that ties in with Dave's presentation as well. Next bit is education. Now, I'm not very good at talking about the stuff I do. I love it, but I don't like plugging my materials. But I'm going to do a little bit here because there are lots of free stuff that's available within the Human Diary. There's a huge blog that's got loads of stuff there. There's regular webinars that are run predominantly at the moment through Dan Southern Africa, but there are others. There's a YouTube channel, there's a Vimeo channel. And then if you want to pay for stuff, there's a new essentials class that'll be released tomorrow night or Monday, depends how quickly I finish the editing for that. It's all ready to go. I just need to tweak some of the bits. There's a 10-week webinar series that goes on into a lot more detail. There's embedded training that you can offer. So Guy, who talked about his human factors in training, technical training, he's launched a new underwater archaeology program in which there's going to be human factors elements in there. So if you're doing something specialized, you can build this into it. And there's also referral programs to encourage instructors to take this on. And then in October, so a month from now, I'm trialing a learning review course with a number of collaborators, including people from Dan, to say, how do we learn from events in a more constructive learning manner than a blame focus, an individual focus that's going on, and looking further back from the proximal causes that are there. And I'm also following some discussions yesterday, going to invite some legal people in there because it's important for them to understand and for us to understand what the legal constraints are. There are loads of books that are out there. These are just some of them that are on my bookshelf, and the rest of the thing goes to the left with probably about 50 books in there, and my Kindle's got a couple of hundred books. There is lots of information that's out there. And then, specifically when it comes to the diving stuff, we can talk about Dan Worldwide, there's Dan Europe, and there's Dan Southern Africa. There are lots of resources that you can go. And now the difficulty there is you have to apply, and I'll talk about that on the very last slide. What I'm doing in terms of research to provide some credibility, and that was something that Simon picked up this morning, is, how do you get that change to happen? So, well, actually, you get some published research and show people, look, this is what happened. You've got to be careful what you do because people might take the wrong end of it, like there was something about hot and cold diving and what that actually meant. And the same thing for the decompression theories of stops that are out there. And people go, right, this is what it means. So there has to be, some skill in terms of getting that communication out there. So 4 bits that are ongoing at the moment. One is to look at the current status of incident reporting systems that are out there. What do they do? What can they export? What learning products are available? So that actually we've got a baseline, because I go and speak to a bunch of different people and they don't know. So this is one thing, is actually collecting what do we do at the moment. The next one is defining an incident, and again, working with some collaborators to say, what do you mean by an incident? Because when I go to presentations, I go to conferences, I say, right, you've got to, it's a good idea, you can report an incident. And the 2 questions that get asked is, what is an incident? And the other one is, where do I report this? So the first one is, to try and define this, and having an open-ended definition like the insurance companies use, that basically said it's something that was trapped before it became a serious event, or something to those words. Well, free flow on a novice diver is probably quite a scary event, but a free flow on a diver who's done a whole bunch of advanced trimix training with twins and stages and all sorts of stuff like that, it's not so much of an event, but the action and the event itself is the same. So we've got to have a little bit more of an understanding. So there's a goal here to go out with something, do something called Delphi study with a bunch of experts within the diving community to say, what is an incident? What's the most important incident? And what should we capture? And then go and do a data collect that's associated with that. Then the next bit is, what does best practice look like for incident reporting systems? Because there's a whole body of evidence that's out there from aviation, healthcare, oil and gas, forest service, fires. All of these things have developed their concepts about what's an incident and how do we report it and how do we share it. And I'll talk about a little picture on, in fact, yes, on the next slide. And the final one is this network of influence mapping and work as imagined, work as done. So getting a real better understanding of what is it that influences divers to do the decisions, take the decisions they do, to take the risks they do, and what can we do to build that into our training programs, to come up with learning products that are associated with that. And a learning product for a novice diver is going to be different to a technical diver. It's going to be different to a dive center manager, which is different to an agency staff member. So understanding that outputs for these things are all different. Oops. Here we go. What is, these are two that are sort of linked together, and it's really difficult to try and get these concepts across. So what's the value of applied human factors? The difficulty here is, and the research shows this, it will take you 1.5 to 2.5 times the perceived value of the change before you even consider it. So it's not even putting what's the cost involved in doing this, it's the perceived value. And this is why the education piece is so large at the moment, because divers don't know what they don't know. I talked about this yesterday at the opening piece. Human factors, well, it's just common sense. It's human error. It's factors of the human. It's not. It's much bigger than that. And what we're trying to do is get away from the safety argument, because safety never sells. To market something is you bring somebody in, or someone, your client, into something, a positive change. Trying to sell safety is about trying to push people away from a threat, and that doesn't work. So there's a definite perspective change that's required, and I get that, and it's a huge marketing problem for me and for my instructors to get that out there, which is why it's the visionaries and the innovators that are bringing this on at the moment. Then there's the bit that says the moral versus the commercial argument, and again, looking at this from a systems point of view, training agencies are companies. Any that are listed there as not-for-profit, they may be not-for-profit, but they still need money coming in. And anything that increases the money out reduces the money or the profit margins, or the sort of the not-for-profit status. So there has to be an understanding of saying, what's the return of investment for this? And it's very difficult at an organizational level. And you can't use the moral argument because they're companies. Now, you should be able to, but that's not how businesses run. And I would recommend a book called Willful Blindness by Margaret Heffernan, who is based just down from Vostra in the UK. Brilliant little TED talk. It's only about 18 minutes if you want to go and watch that. Or there's a whole book on the concept of willful blindness, the recognition that says actually we are immune as an organization from what's going on, and we're just going to turn our eyes away from it. Because actually, if something goes wrong, it's not our problem. And so, which is, in my view, as a values-based person, that's wrong. But I get why it happens, because you've got to take, as Dave highlighted in his presentation, the different perspectives. Why do stakeholders behave the way they do within the system? You have to take a systems view. Now, the final bit I'm going to talk about here is just the map is not the territory. I have some great ideas about how things should be, what that journey would look like as you go around and we navigate and we take human factors further into diving. I remember sitting at a presentation with Mark Powell. I think it was one of the either dive 10 or dive 12 in London. And we just said, this is not a 1-2 year job. This is decades worth of effort required. Aviation started to really bring this in the 60s and 70s, and it still has issues. It's still learning, and then evolving their human factors and threat error management programs. And they've realized that what they're doing is a compliance-based activity. CRM, crew resource management, has become a bit of a tick box exercise, when actually it should be much wider than that, and understanding the bigger system that's out there. And that's not easy, because again, we go back to the return of investment that's there. So bear in mind that just because there's a map, it doesn't match the territory, and it's going to have folds and errors and things like that in it. So my sort of final point is, in fact, I'll go back one because it's on another document, because I want to read what was sent through to me. Because I asked about, why people weren't adopting what's going on, the programs. And this person wrote in with a very insightful piece, which is why I'm going to read it out. It said, in an Instagram social media world, it's easy for people to say they're discussing things that might have gone wrong. It makes for a catchy self-promotional statement, but doing the work to actually apply the ideas and principles takes effort. It requires small businesses, that's speaking from a local dive shop perspective, to challenge all they know, especially if they're tied into a diving agency that's a slow ship to turn around. Hey, it's worked all right so far, hasn't it? I know this is probably an oversimplification, but it's basically easy to try and promote oneself as a human factors conscious diver or pro. It's another thing to apply it and put one's money to attend something like your conference. And I've seen this over the last 2 days where there have been lots of people on social media going, like, share, this is great, attend, and they're not here and they haven't bought the recorded options. So to that end, thank you for investing in your future and the future of other divers that are out there. And if you're in a leadership and an influential position, I am more than willing to talk about how to get this into training agency materials. It's already been done in certain areas. It can be done. Change is hard for a variety of reasons, but it can be done. To that end, that's what I'm going to end with, is knowledge is not enough. We must apply. Willing is not enough. We must do. And to create change, you have to do something, and that can be uncomfortable. I've been at this for 11 years now, and I've invested thousands in it, and I don't mind. Kate might, my wife, but I love what I do, and I love the change that's happened in those 10 or 11 years that we've been talking about human factors, just culture, non-technical skills, and psychological safety. The fact that there are 100 people live who've been, live tickets for this is fantastic. I would love it to be a lot more than that, and there will be another conference, and it's probably going to be 2023, because I want to get ideas and stories and research and get change out there. But if there's going to be a movement and is going to create that change, then actually, why not? Let's make something in 2022. So to that end, thank you very much for all of your participation and listening to this. It's a long day. Tell me about it. Not as long as the guys are in the West Coast of the States. And I'd really like to thank the Lexco team for the platform they've got, and the two producers, Tim and Brian, and the room captains who've been here and introduced and supported all of the stuff that's gone on. I think it's been fantastic, and I've had some great feedback. Please share the stuff, share the stories, share your knowledge. And for me, send me the feedback. Debrief me on what's worked well and why, what needs to improve and how. Be specific. Don't worry about upsetting me. I'm used to critical feedback because that's how we improve. So thank you very much, and have a great remainder of the weekend, wherever you are in the world.